Hello, welcome to Stars, Cells, and God. I'm Jeff Zweerink, and today I'm joined by Dr. Kevin Birdwell, and we are going to be talking about molten salt nuclear reactors. Kevin, good to have you on the show today. Looking forward to what we're going to talk about. Why don't you give a brief introduction of who you are, a little bit of your background or your credentials, and then we'll get right into it.
All right. I'm an atmospheric scientist, and I've done some work in paleoclimatology, but I also do a lot of work in the area of air pollution, meteorology, and modeling pollutants from everything from power plants to natural disasters. And that kind of backed me into the field of nuclear energy safety, and I've been doing some work in that for the last 3 years.
Well, that does seem very relevant because, anytime you start talking about nuclear reactors, most people who are our age are roughly around that. Think about Chernobyl, maybe 3 Mile Island. There's Fukushima, that there are these nuclear reactors that seem to be spraying nuclear or radiation out into the atmosphere and dealing with it. So I know you're going to be talking about a new technology of nuclear reactors. So why don't I just turn the floor over to you and let you present some of your material here.
All right. Thank you. What this really boils down to is energy compliance. So essentially, it's already been mandated that we should reduce our carbon emissions down to something like 0.2 gigatons per year. Right now, world emissions of carbon is something like 36, 37 gigatons per year. So that's a pretty tall order. And
so is that 36 across the world, and across the world we need to get down to 0.2, or 36 across the world and the U.S. needs to get down to 0.2?
No, this is world emissions.
World emissions, okay.
But still, that's a pretty tall task. And, right now, renewable energy is something like 11% of global power demand.
Mm-hmm.
And if you add nuclear to that, you might get that up over 20%. But, at the current rates, by 2050, which is when these goals are set for, we're still probably looking at under 30%.
Mm-hmm.
So obviously we're going to have a challenge to meet there if that is the goal. And I really think that there are some advancements in nuclear energy that really might help a great deal toward getting toward that goal.
So I presume you're burning any sort of fossil fuel burning, you're just going to be incapable of generating the level of power similar to what we are with that sort of 0.2 emissions, because you're giving off carbon dioxide when you're burning it. It doesn't seem like there's any way to really do that with fossil fuels. So it seems like we got to do something besides fossil fuels to meet that goal, correct?
Correct, and nuclear power doesn't give off any fossil fuels,
right.
So it would be very useful in that regard. But to achieve stabilization, it's just very difficult to foresee doing that strictly with wind and solar.
Mm-hmm.
Wind and solar has a place, but it's not beneficial everywhere, and it's not beneficial to power your entire grid on that because of intermittency issues and not being able to necessarily depend on it 24/7.
Well, that's always been a question I've had. Is I know live here in California. Especially as you travel out east of here, Los Angeles area, you drive through a lot of wind farms. I've seen some in Colorado, but there's just lots of places where I don't see any sort of wind farms, and I'm gathering you can't just put those anywhere. It seems kind of further north you get, solar gets a lot harder. So it does seem like that's just got a substantial problem in trying to meet the energy budget of what we require, even just in the United States.
Right, and the world demand is going up. I mean, we're looking at like a 58 quad increase in world demand just in the 2020s.
Put that in context. I don't. What's a quad, and how many quads are we using now?
So the world is using something like 573 quads as of 2023. That's supposed to go up to like 637 by 2030, and that's just a massive number, and it's certainly not something that you can just depend on a diffuse energy source.
So that's like a 10% increase in what we're using above today.
Right.
And even at today's levels, we're having trouble meeting it with just wind and solar power.
Right.
Okay.
And nuclear energy is the most dense, per unit form of energy out there. So in studying this the last few years, it's become very apparent to me that it really makes sense to try to find a way to best use nuclear energy in a safe way. And I will throw in there that even the current nuclear power that we have is among the safest form of energy production out there, despite some of the accidents that have happened.
So two things I want to flesh out a little bit there. You said nuclear energy or nuclear power is the most dense form of power out there. Just kind of explain what that means.
Well, like for example, one of the new types of nuclear fuel is something called TRISO, these little pellets, and these go into what's called a pebble bed reactor. Just one of those little pellets is equivalent to like 4 tons of coal.
Okay.
So there's a lot of power in nuclear power.
So dense you're referring to that with a little bit of mass, you can get an enormous amount of energy out, which
Right.
if you studied nuclear physics, which I happen to have because I'm a physicist,
Right.
It kind of makes sense. It's one of those things that's a little counterintuitive, but honestly, that's why nuclear bombs were so much bigger than conventional bombs, is there's just so much energy stored in the atom that when you can interact with that and get that energy out, it's an enormous amount of energy. So that's effectively what's going on there, correct?
Right, and I think the thing that we really need to realize too about energy sources is we really got to think through what is the how useful is it really going to be to us? So I'm talking about things like resilience, like under different environmental conditions, is it resilient? Is it scalable from a small to a large scale or vice versa? Is it abundant? Is it affordable? That's really important. Is it reliable? Is it flexible? Can we transport it? Like for example, with really any energy source, wherever you put it, you've got to be able to transmit that power to wherever it's going. Now, with wind and solar, it may be close by, but if it's, let's say it's out in the ocean somewhere, it's got to be, you may have to be transmitted over long distances,
Right.
To get where it's needed. With nuclear, you have the potential of putting it anywhere you need it. Now, one limitation has been with standard nuclear power is that you need a lot of water. But with some of the advanced nuclear programs, you really don't, if you use something like molten salt, you don't really have to have a big water source nearby, which opens up the door to put it in some really remote places and probably some very dry places too.
Well, this is an interesting part of this discussion about energy, because often when we talk about green energy or renewable energy, we talk about wind, solar. That's fine and dandy if you live in the South here, because there's a fair bit of wind and it's sunny a lot. But I grew up in Missouri. It's kind of not really sunny through a fair fraction of the year, so it's hard to generate that, and it's not very windy. I mean, there are places where there's wind, but it's not very windy, and so it seems like you run into this. If you ask how many, and I don't know the answer to this, but it seems to me if you were to ask how many wind turbines do you need up to generate the amount of power, you're talking about covering a lot of area, and only certain places in the world are going to be particularly efficient at that. Where if I get what you're saying with the nuclear power, because the energy density and how little mass you need to produce the power, you can actually distribute that around a lot more.
Right, and there are people that will push back on the wind energy thing because calculations have been done that there is adequate wind energy in the world to power the world, but still you've got the issue of transmitting it where you need to go, of maintaining it, and I guess the question would be, do you really want to cover so much of the world with wind turbines when if you've got a more concentrated power source like nuclear, you really don't have to take up that much space?
Right. Yeah, so it seems to me one of the things that is important to think about here is to look at the big picture of what all is entailed in there. So yes, it sounds like I'm down or negative on wind and solar energy. I'm not. But if we're going to talk about meeting the 600 quads of energy that we're going to need over the next decade, you do have to ask how many wind and solar farms are you going to need, and how much of the land is going to be covered with those. And it sounds like it's a pretty sizable amount, even if there is, assuming that there's enough wind and solar energy, which that doesn't surprise me that there is enough to power that. But
Well, I know for the United States, for solar power, it's something like 2 times the size of Texas. And plus, again, there's the issue of maintaining. So, you would, with that many solar panels, like there's a certain large number every day that you would have to replace, because basically they might last 20 or 30 years.
right.
With nuclear plants, depends on the type of nuclear plant, but the ones we have today can last as much as 80 years.
That's pretty remarkable. And again, I think what I've enjoyed about having this discussion with you and talking about this offline and even today is just recognizing that when you take a holistic look at it, it seems like nuclear energy has a very key. It does play an important role, partially because it's a very dense energy source, and it also, I just imagine looking at a map, of the United States. And Texas is a reasonably large fraction of the area of the country, and to have two sections the size of Texas covered in solar panels, that's not a small number of solar panels.
No.
Just last year, I drove to the eclipse, and you drive across Texas for a long time,
Yes.
and I only made it halfway across. So that's just a lot of area to be covering in solar panels.
Well, I think, unfortunately, there's a lot of misunderstanding about nuclear power, and I think that's part of the reason that, because even though Chernobyl, for example, it's a very different design than Western nuclear reactors. That accident would have never happened in the West, and it
Why not? Why not? Why wouldn't it have happened in the West?
Well, there's just a lot of differences. For one, Western reactors have a containment building, like a 3-foot thick reinforced concrete, and then with steel inside of that.
Okay.
5/8 inch steel. So that would have likely contained a steam explosion, but there are other reasons too. For example, most nuclear reactors have a pressure vessel, which is kind of your first line of defense in any type of an accident. And then your fuel rods and all the reactivity is going on inside that.
Right.
But in the case of the Chernobyl reactor, which is called an RBMK reactor, it doesn't have a single pressure vessel. It has 1,600 separate pressure tubes, and it was cheaper to build, basically.
Right, okay.
And they didn't have to go to like another country to build a pressure vessel. So those are two of the big factors right there. And there are some, probably too much to go into here, but it basically causes some reactivity issues. The reactor is so large that it's almost like, the biblical phrase, the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing. The reactor is so big, I think it's about 11 meters across, that you can actually have some issues to where the reactor is not really behaving as one.
Oh, gotcha.
And also something called a positive void coefficient, and this is essentially where instead of the reactor beginning to shut down when it starts to have problems, it actually ramps up.
Oh, really?
So
it sounds like there were a number of design issues that don't apply to reactors that we have produced here in the United States.
Right.
And there's also some culture of how do you build, maintain, and run the reactor that are different than how we operate in the United States. And that both of those factors played into how large of those would mitigate and basically prevent any sort of Chernobyl-type accident from ever happening in the United States.
Yes, and in fairness to those in Russia, that was back in the Soviet era. So this had a lot to do with the politics of the Soviet Union. Today, Russia builds something called a VVER reactor, which stands for water,
Okay.
energetic. And it's much more like a Western reactor.
Gotcha.
But unfortunately,
So there is just an aspect where we need to realize that we've learned from mistakes in the past, and people across the world have learned from mistakes in the past.
absolutely.
Okay.
But the thing is, unfortunately, the accident, even though it wouldn't have happened in the West, it did have a very large impact on the nuclear industry. Mm-hmm. So I've got a chart that should be displayed that on basically how many commercial nuclear power plants were built over the last, say, 50, 60, 70 years.
Right.
And there's a big dip in the number. Very few were built after Chernobyl for about 15 or 20 year period.
Oh, yeah.
And we've started to have a renaissance of nuclear power after about 2005. It still hasn't ramped up to the point that it once was, say, in the 60s or 70s.
Right.
But it is on the upswing now.
So I know, the idea, there's the energy density, but then there's also the safety issue. Why don't you kind of go into talk a little bit about what these molten salt reactors are? Because I know this is a pretty fascinating technology that seems to address a lot of those safety concerns, even in the present reactors. So talk about two things. One, safety just in nuclear energy production now, but even how that would be impacted by these new kinds of reactors.
Okay, well, maybe I should also give a little bit of a primer before I go into that. Essentially, how are these different, and what are reactors like today? So essentially, there's three types of uranium that's fissile, that you can hit it with a neutron and split the atom, and that's essentially what you're doing in a nuclear reactor. You're splitting uranium atoms, and if you get that uranium atom produces enough neutrons that it hits other uranium atoms and keeps the process going.
Right.
So that really can only happen with uranium-233, uranium-235, and plutonium-239. Uranium-235 is the only one that is naturally available. We can make the others. Essentially, there are a couple of other elements that are fissile materials, so you can, such as thorium-232 and uranium-238, and you can hit those with neutrons and go through a little bit of a chain reaction there and end up with either uranium-233 or plutonium-239. Now, the plutonium-239 is rather discouraged because that's a problem with military and proliferation of nuclear weapons and that kind of thing.
So that's the sort of thing, if you want to build a bomb, plutonium-239 is what the material you want to do, or one of the materials. Okay.
That's normally what is used. So the alternative is to use thorium-232, which gives you uranium-233. And you might ask, could you build a bomb with that? Well, in theory, you could, but uranium-233 has some characteristics that if you start enriching it, and that's another thing I should mention too. Nuclear power plants, they deal with like uranium that's enriched by typically 3 to 5%, and even some of the newer designs are less than 20%. You can't have a nuclear bomb with that kind of enrichment.
So enrichment, enrichment is what you mine it out of the ground. It's got some sort of, if you take some amount of rock, it's got so much uranium-233 in it.
No, not 233.
Or, sorry,
235.
Right. Okay.
And 238.
Okay.
But only 0.7% is 235, and that's what we use in nuclear reactors today.
Okay.
So you have to enrich that a little bit to where the reactor can sustain a reaction.
Okay, so you have to more or less concentrate it or make a higher concentration of the uranium that's going to, the fissile uranium.
There are a few reactors that can use natural uranium. The primary one is the CANDU reactor in Canada. Okay. It was kind of designed to use natural uranium. But uranium-233, which is what you would get if you converted thorium-232, unlike 235, if you enrich it enough, then you start to have problems with radioactivity. Okay. And also heat generation and some other things. So it's really not desirable for characters who might want to do bad things with uranium.
Okay.
So to my knowledge, no one has ever used uranium-233 to make a bomb as a result. So
That's actually encouraging to know, because I know part of one of the challenges of dealing with nuclear materials, reactors, is that you do tend to produce these materials that not in a simple way, but with sufficient technology and sufficient expertise, you refine and produce weapons grade materials. But it's interesting to note that there's a way to do this that there's not a weapons channel even in it, because it's almost like the uranium-233 has a block against building a bomb out of it or making it weaponized.
It's fine for low enrichment for power generation, but if you start enriching it, then you're not going to put yourself in a good place,
right?
Trying to do it. So, but yeah. So and there are several reactor designs today. They are all basically based on pressurized water for the coolant and the moderator. Some of them use heavy water, but all of them use water in some form. Right. The molten salt reactor was actually invented in the 1950s and 60s, and there was actually a aircraft research experiment that was trying to make a reactor for an aircraft, basically. And
that seems like a really bizarre concept.
Yeah. Well, this was before they had ballistic missiles, basically.
Okay.
And once that happened, then this kind of went by the wayside. But it was actually test run for something like 80 or 90 hours in an airplane.
Okay.
Back in the 50s, and that led to the molten salt reactor experiment in Oak Ridge, which ran for about 4 or 5 years, and they ran this thing successfully for something like 13,000 hours.
Okay.
And everything I've read about it suggests that it was very reliable. They did not. So I don't want to get ahead of myself here, but they did not put thorium. So what you do in a molten salt reactor potentially is you have your uranium or uranium-233, or you could even use 235 in it. It's in a liquid form instead of a solid form.
Right.
So in today's reactors, you have solid fuel, and they're put in fuel rods, usually with some type of zirconium alloy that's fairly resistant to all the neutron bombardment that's going on. But after, say, 2 years, the rods have decayed or deteriorated enough that you have to take them out. And unfortunately, you've still got 95 to 97, maybe more % of the fuel, potentially useful fuel in there. So you end up with this waste product.
That's fascinating to recognize. I guess never having looked in, I kind of assumed that you would use nuclear rods until the fuel was used up. But it really seems like it's much more of a mechanical reason why we quit using the rods.
Right.
I think that's pretty fascinating, because that means there's still a lot of fuel left in these, what we call nuclear waste, if you will.
But if you put the fuel in a liquid like a molten salt, then you have the potential to burn it up almost completely.
Right.
And even in the case of these pebble bed reactors, which are still solid fuel in molten salt, they still do a lot better than the traditional way of doing it, because I think the number is something like 19% burn up.
Okay.
And it's still a lot lower than 100, but it's way better than 1 or 2%.
Right.
So that's kind of a stepping stone in the direction. Ultimately, where you would want to go is to have your fuel dissolved in the molten salt, so that you can actually remove fission products on the fly, basically.
Right.
And that would allow you to achieve close to 100% burn up, which means you're not going to have very much waste.
That's a remarkable. It's just, even from an efficiency perspective, it seems like this is a huge leap forward in technology to do that. So instead of using 1 to 2% of the fuel and then having it sitting around, you're able to use almost all of it, which given the amount of energy that's in there, that's an enormous amount of energy because there's a lot in a little bit of mass. But now instead of using 1 to 2%, you're using close to 100%. That's like orders of magnitude more energy you're getting out of it.
Right, and also it's a huge advantage in terms of what do you do with the waste,
Right.
because you don't have much. Some of the waste that comes out of solid fuel plants, it can be reprocessed, but it's rather expensive, and so most of the time they just don't.
Right.
And you've got some fission products there that you might have to put away somewhere for many tens of thousands of years. But in the case of...
That's what the conventional,
Right.
what we've been using so far.
Right. Now, having said that, there's not as much of this around as people think. It would fit inside of a football field, maybe 30 feet high, something like that.
So it's a large amount, but not a huge amount.
Right.
It's not
right.
like there's
That-
just
we're talking about the
acres
whole
of it or
nation
something.
stockpile. So
Right.
yeah, and with the molten salt reactor, what you burn it up so well that the products that are left are not radioactive for that long of a period. We're talking maybe 200 or 300 years. And actually, after 10 years, 83% of the material can be used for, industrial purposes, medical purposes. There are a lot of those decay products, like actinium-225, for example, is very useful as a medical isotope.
Right.
It's very effective at treating cancer. It goes right to the cancer cell. You set it up right. It has like a 10-day half-life.
right.
So when it decays, it destroys the cancer cell. People, for instance, people with prostate cancer, this would be incredibly beneficial. Now, there are people treated with it today. The problem is we don't have a means of making very much of it. If we had molten salt reactors in the thornium cycle, we would be able to make a lot of it.
Yeah, I know when just various places in my physics classes, I would have, they'd have these little, discs of material that had different kinds of radioisotopes so that we could measure various things in there. Sounds like, if I get what you're saying, that in the way these molten salt reactors would work, it would make those resources far more abundant so that we could use them. We tend to think of radiation as bad, but we use it for a lot of very useful purposes. And it surprised me to find out that there are certain uses for that where the limit is on the amount that we can produce.
Exactly. Well, if you've most of us have had medical procedures, many medical procedures that use some form of radiation to see what's going on inside of us, or,
Right.
So it's a really common thing. But real advancements could be made with this kind of a thing. I wanted to say that molten salt reactors, unfortunately, even though the first run was successful, it kind of got off to a unfortunate start. So in the early 70s, Alvin Weinberg, who was the director of Oak Ridge National Lab at that time, and really the guy that kind of invented nuclear power to start with.
Okay.
He was Mr. Nuclear Power. Very brilliant guy. I think he became director at the age of 35, which is really unheard of.
That's remarkable.
But he made this statement that I want to read about molten salt technology. He says, molten salt technology is entirely different from the technology of any other reactor. To the inexperienced, fluoride technology is daunting, and he's talking about the molten salt there. Perhaps the moral to be drawn is that a technology that differs too much from an existing technology has not one hurdle to overcome to demonstrate its feasibility, but another even greater one. To convince influential individuals and organizations who are intellectually and emotionally attached to a different technology that they should adopt a new path. It was a successful technology that was dropped because it was too different from the main lines of reactor development. I hope that in a second nuclear era, the fluoride reactor technology, that's what he called the molten salt reactor, will be resurrected. So I think we're starting that second era of nuclear technology now. So hopefully it will fare better. And I can explain some of the things associated with it that are maybe of some concern to some people. Really, as I said, the reactor did very well. So I've got a diagram that shows the basics of it. You've got a core, just like any other reactor, where the fission is happening. So the uranium-233, let's say, is in there. But around the core, you have a blanket of thorium, because what you want is the neutrons that don't go into fission, that escape the immediate reactor, they hit the thorium and start a process of converting it. It goes through a couple of other elements. I think protactinium is one of them. But basically it takes about a month, 27 days, for the most of the process to happen. So essentially you're cycling thorium through a blanket around the reactor, and then you're moving it off to finish its decay into 233, uranium-233, and then you bring it back into the reactor later to keep the power going. So as long as you got thorium, and there is a lot of that in the world, right now we use uranium-235 in reactors, and some people say that's like burning platinum or gold because it's only 0.7 of the uranium in the world, 0.7%. But thorium is like 400 times more abundant than at uranium-235. So there is really a potential here for a huge energy source that we really haven't even tapped into.
So presumably wherever we've gone and mined uranium, there's a whole bunch of thorium sitting around where we've kind of at least done part of the process to even get to it.
Well, rare earth mining, which is very common today, usually ends up with a lot of thorium as well that there really isn't a big use for at the moment. So there really isn't a difficulty.
I'm gathering it's kind of a waste product for a lot of the things that people are doing, which would turn it into a
yes.
What we're already doing and what we're throwing away as waste now would become very useful.
Yes, and that's the way I would look at it. There's really a great potential here to use turn a waste product into something good. Unfortunately, this whole thing went by the wayside for, I would say, about 40 years. Alvin Weinberg, the guy I just mentioned, he essentially advocated for this and said that we needed to go this direction with nuclear power to molten salts. And at the time, the interests in the U.S. government and research were different. Some have argued there were some political factors in there too, that money, it was desired that money be sent elsewhere. And for other projects. There was an interest back then in making plutonium, and you're not really going to do that with molten salt reactors. So it just basically went nowhere. After the mid-'70s, the project was completely shut down and just sat there. And so now about, let's say, 15 years ago, that began to change. There were some people advocating for it, and a few years later, the government kind of opened up nuclear power research to the private sector. And so now you have a lot of private companies that are designing reactors and planning to build them, or some are even in the process. But it's a slow process, and it hasn't really reached the point yet of, what I would call a moon mission project like what we had in the 60s. That would be, in my opinion, something that would be really nice to see, because even with that, we might be looking at 10 years, and without it, we might be looking at 20 before we are able to actually have these as power plants providing power to the public.
Well, it sounds like there's a couple of issues going on. If I get what you're saying, there's what does it take to actually produce one of these, and there's a time frame that's many years to propose it, get it, to figure out how to design it, how to build it, all that sort of stuff. But then there's also, it seems like there's a little bit of a intellectual desert that we're operating in because people haven't been working in this. So they're scaling enough people up to know how to work at design, do all that sort of stuff. Both of those things are kind of slowing it down right now.
That is true. I've heard people talking about some of the original folks that worked on the original MSRE project, and as it's called, molten salt reactor experiment. And a lot of these guys have either passed away or they're in their 80s or 90s, and have been retired for a long time. There's definitely a big upswing, and I think if you're a young person looking for something to go into, I think advanced nuclear is something that you might have some success at.
I'm just going to emphasize that because I think that's an important point to, if you want to look at something where there's going to be a payoff, I think the molten salt reactor, just from talking with you, there's a very promising technology to go into, and it's something where it's almost where there's going to be benefit. You're not guessing, hopefully this will pan out. It's going to be a lot of work to make it happen, but that's very attractive to me to know that there's benefit. It's just a matter of putting in the work to make it happen.
Well, the only molten salt reactor I know that is online today, that is similar to the MSRE, is one that was just recently built in northwest China, and it's mostly based on the Oak Ridge design, maybe with a few enhancements. But the data from the Oak Ridge experiment was released in the early 2000s, and so it was made publicly available. But there are some Western projects that are going to be coming online soon. They're kind of taking baby steps, so they're not just going straight to doing the full thorium blanket and everything, but they're starting with the molten salt and in most cases uranium, and then building out from there. So I know, for example, Texas Christian University in Abilene, they are constructing a 1 megawatt, very small experimental molten salt reactor, which is going to use uranium that's a little bit more enriched than normal. So there's this.
So you said 1 megawatt. Typically, large power plants
very
are kind
small.
of a gigawatt. So this is like 1,000 times smaller than what you're normally doing.
But their design is to, their idea is to foster research and move forward medical research as well. In terms of the power side of things, there's a company by the name of Kairos Power, which is building a 15 megawatt demonstration reactor in Oak Ridge. And it is a molten salt reactor using the lithium fluoride beryllium mixture salt. It's called FLIBE.
I love that.
Short.
Love the words that physicists come up
but
with.
But it's a pebble bed reactor.
Okay.
So it's not using thorium, but it is using the triso fuel I mentioned earlier, the small pebbles, and so it is going to get between the fact that it's molten salt and it's triso, it will have a much better efficiency than a regular power plant. Now they're going to scale that up. I believe it was something like 140 megawatts, and so these would be in the class of small modular reactors. Right. And then they hope that by the 2030s they'll actually be producing power with some of these. So both of those two I just mentioned are probably going to be online in the 26-27 time frame.
So just next 2-3 years then.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, and there's another. A molten chloride salt reactor that's being designed in conjunction with Idaho National Lab that in Idaho Falls that is really planning to burn up some of the waste that we already have from the older nuclear power plants. So we can actually recycle this waste in a molten salt reactor and use it for power or use it for whatever purposes.
That seems like a pretty profound idea there. Kind of flesh that out a little bit for us because, you were talking about we got basically a football field 30 feet deep, which is a lot, but not as much as I would have imagined there was of stuff that's going to be radioactive for the next 10, 20, 30,000 years. sounds like we can actually use these reactors while we're producing fuel to actually get rid of this waste product.
Yes, and the guy that's in charge of that program, he doesn't even want to talk about thorium until he burns up this waste. So, but essentially, it gets it keeps getting recycled into the molten salt until it's essentially burned up. And there's probably a considerable number of years of power that can be generated from that. I don't think we're talking about a gigawatt scale thing here. It's more on the small modular reactor size, maybe like 300 megawatts, give or take. But there are several interesting projects going on. Even the CANDU reactors I mentioned earlier, they're doing something with something called HALEU. HALEU it's an enriched uranium, but a little more not highly enriched, but enriched enough that maybe it's 10%, 15%, and so you're going to get better power reactivity out of a smaller amount, basically. So a lot of these plants, and there is a bit of a holdup with getting that. So one molten salt reactor I didn't mention is TerraPower, which is being built in, and it's not really a molten salt reactor. It's sort of along in that direction, but it's a liquid sodium reactor.
Okay.
So it's using sodium as the coolant, which also has like the molten salts, has a very high, it's liquid for a very large range, like 800 and something C.
Right.
So, but it kind of functions like a molten salt reactor in many respects. It's more efficient, and they're actually wanting to couple that with like a solar power plant that uses a different kind of molten salt to store the heat.
Right.
In it. So I think that's kind of a novel concept as well. But a few of these designs, including TerraPower's, they're probably going to be delayed a couple of years because of the HALEU supply that they're waiting on.
Oh, gotcha. So there's just not enough of it to run.
Yeah, so maybe it's 2030 instead of 2028 or something like that.
Question, we're kind of going to wrap up a little bit here. I have one question. I'll let you make your kind of final comments, then we'll wrap up. But so when we're talking about modular reactors, these are things that produce, a few hundred megawatts. Are these the sorts of reactors you could go take somewhere and export to other countries? Are they kind of self-sustaining, or, I just imagine so right now we generate power. You've got to have wires that run it everywhere. There's a lot of infrastructure that it takes to use it. Is this the sort of thing you could take to somewhere where they're just kind of very primitive?
Absolutely.
And you could go in and say, let's set up a small one of these. There's enough expertise in the people around that you could make run. And so you could actually be providing power to people that would otherwise not have it using these sorts of reactors. Is that the right way to look at it, or am I missing something?
I think it might be a very small reactor, but in some cases, but yes, you could do that. And, there's a company right now that's got a contract with Indonesia, and they're essentially building these things in shipyards and then bringing them over on ships.
Oh, wow.
The one other thing I wanted to mention before I give you some final things here is the supercritical CO2. So one thing we haven't talked about is almost all conventional power plants, nuclear or otherwise, what they're doing is they're creating heat.
Right.
And they're sending that heat to a steam generator, which then sends the steam to a turbine, which spins and creates electricity. That's how it works that way in a coal power plant. It works that way in a nuclear power plant.
Effectively, it's just the difference is how are you getting the heat to drive the whole process?
Yes. But now there is some research going on with supercritical CO2. So kind of like, having liquid and gas properties at the same time if you put it under the right pressure and temperature. And the advantage of building a turbine with supercritical CO2 is it's like 10 times smaller. And if you've ever stood next to a steam turbine, they are huge, like a bus, bigger. And I've seen pictures of CO2 turbines that, the guy's holding it in his arms, basically. these have the potential for operating under higher temperatures than steam turbines, and therefore increasing the already good efficiency of a molten salt reactor even more. So people are doing research with those as well, and possibly coupling them with molten salt reactors. But just to kind of wrap up, I'll give you the challenges first. I really don't see anything that I've researched with molten salt reactors that looks like a deal breaker. I mean, there are challenges to overcome, but they don't seem insurmountable.
Right.
So one thing that typically is being done now is, even though you could in theory go up to like 1,000 C or something, the higher the temperature, the more the efficiency improves. So right now in a nuclear power plant, you get 33% efficiency roughly. So you're producing 3 times as much heat as you're able to convert to electricity. The efficiency might be 40, 50% or better with some molten salt reactors.
Just because you can run everything at a higher temperature, and you're going to be more efficient that way.
Right. But it's the reason for limiting things to 700 C is because of corrosion issues. So you could in theory go higher, but we've got to have the materials to work with the molten salt to make that happen. Also, you need lithium-7, at least for FLIBE, and you also need to know what to do with the tritium. So you produce a lot of tritium with a molten salt reactor. The question isn't so much that we can't remove it, but it's kind of like, where is it best to try to remove it in the process? Because it's a pretty slippery, small molecule.
Well, don't you just take it, and then you have Doc Ock, he generates the power of the sun from the tritium. Sorry, old Spider-Man reference.
Well, I do know that people who are working on fusion power are interested in the tritium.
I could imagine that, yes.
And there are also some issues with the beryllium toxicity in FLIBE. Now, not all molten salts are FLIBE. There are other, molten chloride salts. There are several different ones that people are working with. But those are basically the main limitations that we're trying to work through, and people are working on those. I attend a molten salt reactor conference every year, and a lot of people will come up and talk about a lot of these issues and what they're doing about them. But advantages, I think there's so many advantages.
Right.
Number one, low pressure coolant. So instead of having to run at 90 to 150 atmospheric pressure, which is the reason you have the containment building, because you're worried about a steam explosion with radioactive fission materials in it.
I think that's worth emphasizing, is that, I think a lot of people see, explosion in a nuclear reactor and assume it's a nuclear explosion.
It's not a nuclear explosion.
It's a steam explosion because of the containment and the pressures you have to run at.
Yes, but if you're running molten salt, you don't have to run it under pressure. So there's no potential for a steam explosion.
Right.
It just, if something goes wrong, it just drains out of the tank, takes the fuel with it, and it just shuts down. You just walk away. The thorium cycle has a low absorption cross section, and that's actually more meaningful to nuclear engineers. But basically, what it means, it's fairly easy for the neutrons to hit the next uranium molecule. Efficient. I already mentioned the high temperature. That makes things more efficient. And actually, if you're running at these very high temperatures, you even have the potential of using some of that excess heat to for industrial purposes that need high heat. So if you can locate it next to somebody that needs high heat for their industrial process, that's even better. The current generation of nuclear power is around 300 C. That's really not hot enough for that kind of thing. The fission products, which is the waste products, you can remove them in real time because you're dealing with liquid. And I haven't mentioned xenon-135, but that is a gas that comes out of the nuclear process, and nuclear engineers are always trying to manage xenon-135 because it absorbs neutrons like crazy. And it can shut down your nuclear reaction if you don't manage it properly. Well, in this case, it's very easy to just let it bubble out.
Just evaporates off. That's nice.
And you get far less waste. We've already talked about that. There's much more thorium available. We mentioned the medical isotope production.
Right.
Also, there's a way to make plutonium-238, not 239, which is used for fueling spacecraft. And my understanding is that there's getting to be a shortage of that.
Interesting.
And then it'll improve rare earth mineral production because now you've got something to do with the thorium. And best of all, it's a fossil-free fuel source.
Right. Well, that seems like a good place to wrap up. As you know, you're mentioning what we need to do. We need to take our current CO2 production from 38 down to 0.2. This seems like a great way. You know, it's poised to make a huge energy contribution and has virtually no carbon footprint to it.
Right. And I actually found, when I was researching for this, I actually found an article where someone had tried to do a calculation on, first they did it for wind and solar, and then they did it for advanced nuclear, and the number, you know, like what would happen, how much would you have to spend if you converted the whole U.S. to, say, like wind and solar? And the number, and this number may be a year or two old, but it was something like $17 trillion, and then maybe another $7 trillion to deal with the storage issues of the energy, like batteries and so on. But for the nuclear, it was more on the order of $7 trillion.
Okay.
And maybe even a little less than that if you're focusing more on molten salt.
Gotcha.
So
it's got a big cost savings to it on top of all that. Any final comments before we wrap up here?
I would just say that, you know, as somebody who gets to do a lot of research on energy, I was very excited when I first found out about this a few years ago because, you know, it really seems like a real potential solution. Not saying that we can't use wind and solar. There's a place for a lot, and other things, geothermal and so on. But they can't be used everywhere at all times, and we really need something that is very dependable and can supply a lot of energy for growing demands. And I think advanced nuclear and molten salt is one of the best things I've seen come along in a good while.
Well, thanks. I really appreciate your comments and want to thank you for joining us today and encourage you to join the discussion in the comments below. Remember to like this video also, subscribe for more content. We release new episodes every Wednesday of Star Cells and God. You can get it here on YouTube and on your favorite podcast app. Share this video with a friend and have a great conversation about it. And remember, the more we know about science, the more we have reasons to believe.